Okay, so Venerable Sumton's away for the week, but she had asked me to give a BBC on a letter that she saw in Letters to the Editor from a recent Time magazine. So I'll read it. It's apparently about an article that Time did on military suicide. The letter's written by Alexandra Gray, Sergeant, U.S. Army. And she says, your report on suicide in the military was beautifully written. Yet you have to understand that when we come to Afghanistan, part of us never leaves. Part of me will always be here among the mountains, among the suffering that I've seen. Most of us learn to live without that part of ourselves. Some of us don't. And the truth is, the gap between us soldiers and those who have never been to war, those who have not seen and so cannot understand, is unbridgeable. For some of us, the loneliness, the inability to explain goes on and on. The Army does what it can, but in the space inside of us where the war never ends, everything it does will never be enough. I've lost 5 soldiers I knew personally to suicide in the last 18 months. I don't say any of this lightly, but there are some torments that all the health care and all the support in the world will not ease. If this war has taught me anything, it most certainly has taught me that. So there's a lot of pain and suffering in that email. There's also a lot of wisdom. And it must have been in 2002, or 2003, I read a manuscript, because the people I was living with, their neighbor, had been a psychiatrist in the Veterans Administration, and he had written about, what healing these soldiers have to go through after being in combat. And he was mostly writing about his experience with soldiers from World War II and the Korean War, and a little bit about the Vietnam War. And I read this manuscript, and it was unpublished at the time, and it really touched me very deeply. And I said to my friends, because we were just starting the war in Iraq then, I said, please tell him he needs to take this to a big publisher and get this published, because people need to know what he said. He didn't. He took it to a small publisher, and I think they did 1,000 copies. But it's a pity, because this book really helped me so much more to understand what the soldier here was saying. Because when you, and I'm describing it never having experienced it myself, but from what I glean, when you grow up here, it's a certain environment. You get used to certain ways of people treating each other, and you think that's normal. When you go to war, people treat each other in completely different ways. And when put in certain situations that you would never encounter in a civilian life, you know, in a war situation, you don't really know what you're going to encounter. Yeah, were you in a war situation, or?
Never in a combat zone.
Never in a combat, but you were in the military, and also in the military, but not in combat. Yeah, that, the things you do, because you're making decisions on the spur of the moment like this, and you make a decision, and then you have to live with that for the rest of your life. And sometimes at the spur of the moment, maybe you do something to preserve yourself, but not to save your buddy, you know. And human beings are, by nature, we care for ourselves first, but then people torment themselves over that for the rest of their lives, because the bonding in the military is something that, and in a combat zone, where that is unlike any other human bonding, because you really, your whole life depends on the other people, you know, and you know your life depends on them, and they know their life depends on you. Yeah, and yet these things happen that come out of the blue and you have to react instantaneously. You don't have time to sit and meditate on it and contemplate on it. And yet the decision is something you have to live with for the rest of your days. So there's that element, and then there's the element of coming back home after being in combat and being among civilians who have no clue at all what you've experienced. No clue, you know. They've been driving their SUVs in town to the shopping center. You've been driving your Humvee in a combat zone trying to evade, you know, IEDs, yeah. And it's two completely different experiences, and to try to explain to the people you love what you've experienced is like, how are they ever going to get it? They've never lived anything that's even remotely close to that. And so the distance between trying to describe your experience to somebody who you love, who you want to understand, is so difficult. So many soldiers close down that part of themselves just to try and adapt to civilian life again and to have normal, quote, quote, normal relationships. But I can understand that it might be completely like, how can you put two and two together when you've seen people die, and maybe you've even participated in people dying, and then you come back and people are talking about the prices at the grocery store, or what so-and-so said to so-and-so, or, you know, this minor insult, that minor insult. How do you relate to these kind of things after you've seen more, you know? And the people around you haven't seen that. And how do you even begin to tell them? Yeah? So I think it must be quite lonely and, you know, very difficult for many of the veterans coming back. And I think this is why the support groups amongst veterans are so important, because they can really open up and talk to other people about what they've experienced. And the other people get it because they've been in those kind of dire situations. So, you know, I can also understand that some people must feel so locked within themselves, or so, you know, their minds tend to torment themselves so much about something they did that was a snap decision. But then later you make yourself so guilty and so this and so that, with all this conception, you know, that you know, that you make it so you can't live with yourself, and suicide happens. Usually before suicide there's drug addiction and alcoholism, you know, people trying to medicate their pain. You know, so she's saying, you know, no matter what healthcare services they offer, you know, it's very difficult to touch that place in a soldier's heart. I like to think that somehow, if you meet compassionate people that you can really open up to, who, you know, who will listen without judging, you know, that maybe some of that can be healed. I mean, I've seen that happen here at the Abbey. We had one man, a young man, come who was in Iraq, and then he became a conscientious objector while he was in Iraq. He felt very guilty about it on one hand because all of his buddies thought he was copping out, but he was just living according to his conscience. And I think him being here at the Abbey, where we all supported his decision to be a conscientious objector, really healed part of him, you know. And last year we had somebody who was in combat in Iraq, and, you know, I think it was very helpful for him to be able to talk. You know, he you know, had to do things little by little. We never heard everything, you know, but certain little points would come out in discussion, and I think he felt safe enough to say those things here. And I certainly appreciated when he opened up and said those things, because it helped me to understand him and to understand, you know, the thousands of vets that are coming back that this country doesn't understand. You know, and I'm not just talking about the Veterans Administration, but just the population. And it's making me reflect back on the Vietnam War vets. And, you know, I know their situation was quite special, because unlike the World War II vets, who everybody hailed as, you know, wonderful upholders of freedom, the Vietnam War vets just got trashed upon by so much of the population. And I never understood why so many people treated them badly, because the soldiers themselves were not the ones who were responsible for the war. You know, they did what the government said. Yeah, and so I never felt that the soldiers themselves should be blamed for what happened, you know. But I realized it was very difficult for so many of them coming back, you know, especially when people booed them and called them names and all. So quite difficult for them. So I hope we all just kind of think about this and arouse our compassion for people who, you know, are going to war to do what, you know, to fight what they think, you know, for what they believe in. So whether we agree with the war or don't agree with the war, human beings are always worthy of compassion. Yeah. And so I'm hoping somehow that we Buddhists can, you know, create a space for vets to come and really be healed by the Buddha's message. I know Thich Nhat Hanh has done a lot of that with Vietnam War vets. Just amazing stuff, you know. So I'm hoping that we can play a role in that, however we can.